The glossy black Bentley came to rest outside the Fresh Value supermarket like a displaced artifact from another dimension. Dorchester in October carried the muted palette of working-class Boston faded storefronts, cracked asphalt, the lingering smell of diesel from delivery trucks, and into this landscape, the luxury sedan introduced a jarring geometry of wealth. Chrome gleamed under weak afternoon sun. Tinted windows reflected the handful of shoppers who had frozen mid-step plastic bags dangling from forgotten hands. The driver's door opened. A woman emerged in fluid motion, cream-colored jumpsuit tailored to precision, red-soled Louboutin heels, clicking against pavement with the authority of someone accustomed to boardrooms and quarterly earnings calls. Her hair caught autumn light pulled back to reveal diamond studs that threw fractured rainbows across the watching faces. The Cartier watch on her wrist cost more than most of these cars combined. She moved through the stairs like someone who had long ago stopped counting them. Victoria Sterling. The name carried weight across 3 continents. Founder and CEO of Apex Technologies, the cloud computing firm that had redefined enterprise AI infrastructure. Forbes cover subject. Net worth hovering around $2.8 billion, give or take $100 million, depending on market fluctuations. The woman mothers held up as proof their daughters could have anything. The executive other CEOs studied for patterns they could replicate. She was walking toward the shopping carts, more specifically toward the man standing beside them with a push broom in his weathered hands. Marcus Chen wore the navy blue uniform of someone paid to be invisible. The fabric had gone thin at the elbows from too many washings, the name tag slightly crooked above his chest pocket. His black hair needed cutting, falling past his collar in uneven lengths. Stubble shadowed his jaw, not fashionable, just neglected. His shoulders curved inward in the universal posture of people trying to take up less space in the world. He looked up when the heels reached his peripheral vision. Confusion flickered across features that might have been handsome under different circumstances if they hadn't been carved hollow by something that went deeper than mere exhaustion. Victoria stopped less than 3 feet away. Her smile carried warmth that didn't quite reach the calculation in her eyes, the kind of expression honed through 1,000 investor pitches. The words emerged clear despite the traffic noise from the nearby intersection. "My name is Victoria." Marcus blinked, his grip tightened on the broom handle. Around them, the small crowd that had been pretending not to stare gave up the pretense entirely. Phones appeared. An elderly woman fumbled with her cart trying to maneuver closer without being obvious. His voice came out rough, unpracticed. "Rowan." A beat of silence. "Marcus Chen." Something in his eyes sharpened despite the fatigue. Recognition dawned slowly like clouds parting to reveal terrain he'd stopped expecting to see. Victoria Sterling stood 3 feet away in a supermarket parking lot, and he knew exactly who she was because her face had been on the cover of the business magazine someone left in the break room last month. What he didn't understand was why. The confusion must have shown. Victoria's smile shifted into something more genuine, possibly amused by his obvious bewilderment. Her next words came measured as if she'd rehearsed them, but wanted them to sound spontaneous. "I've been watching you." The murmur from the growing crowd rose half an octave. Marcus's eyebrows drew together. This had to be some elaborate joke, a prank, for one of those hidden camera shows that thrived on public humiliation. Except Victoria Sterling didn't do reality television. She testified before Congress. She keynoted at Davos. She continued before he could formulate a response. "For the past 3 weeks, I've come here almost every day." His throat worked. The broom handle might have been the only thing keeping him upright. "I've seen how you talk to customers. Not because you have to, but because you actually listen." Her voice carried clearly despite staying low intimate. "I've seen you explain change to that little P, patient, clear, like someone who actually knows how to teach." Marcus felt something cold spreading through his chest. This woman had been observing him, cataloging his movements. The thought should have alarmed him more than it did, but mostly he just felt tired. "I've heard you discussing business optimization with the warehouse manager." Victoria's eyes held his steady and certain. "Algorithms, data analytics, things people don't usually learn while mopping floors." The crowd pressed closer. Someone's phone chirped a notification that they'd started streaming live. Marcus finally found his voice. "I know who you are, Miss Sterling." The words came out flat, defensive. "Chwamam." I just don't understand what you want from someone like me. The question hung between them, stark and honest. Victoria's expression shifted again, and for just a moment something vulnerable crossed her face before discipline reasserted itself. She took a breath that seemed to draw from somewhere deeper than her lungs. I don't know exactly who you are, or where you came from, or what brought you to this parking lot with that broom. A pause. But I truly believe that you don't belong here. You just need someone to see that. Marcus felt his pulse in his temples. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. So I want to ask you the craziest question of my life. The parking lot might have stopped breathing. Even the traffic seemed to quiet as if the universe had decided to pay attention. Victoria's voice didn't waver. Will you marry me? The words landed like a physical blow. Marcus actually took a step backward, nearly dropping the broom. Around them, the crowd erupted in gasps and exclamations. The elderly woman clutched her chest. Two teenagers nearly dropped their convenience store drinks. A man in a Honda Civic rolled down his window, leaning out to confirm he'd heard correctly. Inside the supermarket, employees pressed against the glass, mouths open in identical expressions of shock. Marcus stared at her. His first thought was that she'd lost her mind. His second was that he'd lost his. The third thought, arriving with bitter clarity, was that this had to be performance art or some kind of publicity stunt. Rich people did incomprehensible things for attention. A smile twisted his mouth, sharp and joyless. If you're really serious. His voice carried an edge that might have been anger, or might have been the sound of someone who'd stopped caring what happened next. Go inside, buy a ring, come back out here, kneel down and ask me again, like you actually mean it. The crowd's murmuring intensified. Someone shouted, "Is he crazy? Who turns down a billionaire?" Victoria didn't flinch. No embarrassment colored her cheeks. No irritation tightened her jaw. She simply nodded once with the same decisive movement she probably used to approve nine-figure acquisitions. One word, all right. She turned on those expensive heels and walked toward the supermarket entrance. The automatic doors parted for her like servants. Marcus stood motionless, still gripping the broom, while the crowd buzzed around him with speculation and disbelief. His heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't real. None of this could be real. 5 minutes stretched into small eternities. He considered walking away, getting in his beaten Toyota and driving until the tank ran empty. But his legs wouldn't move, and some perverse curiosity nailed his shoes to the asphalt. The automatic doors opened. Victoria emerged carrying a small black velvet box. The murmuring died. Phones lifted higher, recording everything for an audience that would stretch into the millions before sunset. Victoria walked directly to him. No hesitation, no second thoughts visible in her stride. She stopped in the same spot as before, then did something that turned the surreal into the impossible. She lowered herself to one knee on the dusty parking lot pavement. The cream jumpsuit would be ruined. The Louboutin heel dug into grit and cigarette butts. She opened the velvet box. The diamond caught sunlight and threw it back in sharp fragments. Not enormous. Nothing ostentatious, but clear and brilliant enough to prove she'd bought the most expensive ring. Fresh Value's limited jewelry counter could provide. $47,000 for a moment of theater that might change everything or mean absolutely nothing. Victoria's voice emerged steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. Marcus Chen. She looked up at him, and whatever he saw in her eyes made something crack in the careful walls he'd built around himself. Will you marry me? Marcus stood frozen. The world reduced to this, a billionaire, kneeling in front of him, dozens of phones recording his own pulse, loud enough to drown out traffic. Behind the shock and confusion, something else stirred. Something he'd thought died 5 years ago in the Allegheny Mountains. The faint, terrifying possibility that someone saw him as human instead of wreckage. His throat closed. Words seemed impossible. But somehow they came barely audible over the blood rushing in his ears. Yes. A shaking breath. I will. The parking lot detonated, cheers and applause mixed with crying and laughter. The live streams multiplied exponentially. Victoria slid the ring onto his hand, rough with calluses, dirt under the nail skin that hadn't felt jewelry in half a decade. He stared at it like it belonged to someone else's story. She stood. A smile transformed her face into something younger, more open than the corporate mask she'd worn arriving. Marcus looked at her, then at the growing crowd, then back at the diamond glinting on his finger. Everything felt unmoored from reality. Victoria's next words carried quiet authority. "Now get into the car." He hesitated, glancing down at his faded uniform. The gap between them might as well have been measured in light years. His voice emerged small. "I'll dirty your seat," a gesture toward the Bentley. "That car's worth more than everything I've ever owned combined." Victoria's response came without pause. "Leather seats can be clean. This moment can't." Marcus carefully removed his apron, folding it with the same attention someone might give a flag at a military funeral. The ritual of letting go. He'd done this before, put aside old identities, stepped into unknown futures. Usually it ended badly. Victoria opened the passenger door. The interior smelled of new leather and subtle cologne. Climate control whispered against his skin. Marcus lowered himself onto the seat, every movement careful, as if sudden motion might shatter the illusion. The door closed with the solid thunk of German engineering. Through the tinted window, the crowd still stared. Phones still recorded. The parking lot that had been his entire world for 3 years receded as the Bentley pulled smoothly into traffic. Marcus sat rigid, clutching the canvas bag on his lap that contained everything he owned. 2 changes of clothes, a photograph, and the broken pieces of a life he'd stopped trying to repair. His eyes tracked between Victoria's profile and the road ahead. She drove with the same confidence she'd shown proposing merging into Boston traffic, like someone who'd never doubted her right to occupy any space. Soft jazz filtered through speakers. The electric engine made almost no sound. Everything felt like a fever dream constructed from exhaustion and malnutrition. This morning he'd been invisible. Now he sat in a car that cost more than his parents' house, wearing a diamond ring, engaged to a woman he had watched on television accepting awards. What does she want from me? The question circled his thoughts like a vulture. Is she insane? Are we both? Victoria glanced at him. Her eyes, he saw them clearly now. Not hidden behind distance or glass, showed intelligence in something else. Loneliness, maybe? The kind that came from having everything except what mattered. She didn't speak. Neither did he. The silence between them filled with unasked questions and the weight of decisions neither fully understood yet. Marcus's hands shook slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the terrible hope that, maybe impossibly, this wasn't just another cruel joke the universe decided to play. They drove through Back Bay, past brownstones that housed old money and newer fortunes. Victoria signaled, turned onto Newbury Street. The shopping district stretched ahead, all high-end boutiques and restaurants, where appetizers cost more than Marcus made in a week. The Bentley stopped in front of a barber shop whose sign read "The Gentleman's Quarter" in elegant script. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, Marcus glimpsed marble floors and leather chairs that looked more suited to executive offices than haircuts. A man in a crisp white shirt and gray vest stepped out before they'd fully parked. His professional smile faltered microscopically when he registered Marcus's appearance, then snapped back into place so smoothly it might never have slipped. The recovery happened faster when he recognized Victoria emerging from the driver's side. His voice carried practiced deference. "Miss Sterling." A slight bow. "We're honored to serve you." Victoria moved toward the entrance. Marcus followed each step, feeling like crossing into foreign territory. The barbershop's interior smelled of expensive cologne and leather conditioner. Classical music played at a volume designed to suggest refinement without interfering with conversation. Victoria's instructions came clear and unhurried. "He's with me. I want the best service you offer." A pause that somehow conveyed both request and command. Everything. Haircut, shave, skincare. All of it. The man-owner-manager, whatever hierarchy governed places like this, simply nodded. In Victoria Sterling's world, there were no questions, only execution. She turned to Marcus. Something softer entered her expression. "Let them take care of you. I'll wait outside." Marcus wanted to protest. This wasn't necessary. He didn't deserve it. The words formed but never made it past his throat because Victoria had already turned away, stepping back into afternoon sunlight before he could articulate the 1,000 reasons this was wrong. For the next 90 minutes, Marcus sat motionless in a leather chair that probably cost more than his monthly rent used to before he lost the house and learned to live in his car. Unfamiliar hands worked on his body with professional detachment. They cut his hair, long tangles falling to the floor in dark clumps, years of neglect swept away lock by lock. They washed what remained with herbal shampoo that smelled like forests he'd stopped noticing existed. They wrapped his face in hot towels that softened skin he'd forgotten could feel anything except wind and cold. Then came the razor. The barber stropped the blade with rhythmic precision. Marcus closed his eyes as steel touched his cheek, each stroke gliding over stubble with the barest whisper of resistance. The beard had been Elena's idea years ago when they were young, and mornings meant lazy conversations in bed. She'd watched him shave one Sunday and smiled that particular smile that meant mischief. Her voice memory clear despite 5 years of silence. "I like you better with a beard, more masculine." So he'd grown one, kept it trimmed and neat because she liked running her fingers through it while they watched movies, Emma and Noah asleep upstairs, the house quiet except for their breathing. After they all died, he'd stopped shaving. The beard grew wild and uneven because grooming implied caring about appearance. And appearance implied being seen, and being seen meant acknowledging he still existed in a world that had no right to continue without them. Now it fell away, strand by strand, the last thread connecting him to that person he'd been, the husband, the father, the man who believed happiness was a permanent condition instead of a temporary gift the universe could revoke without warning. Tears slipped out before Marcus could stop them, hot trails mixing with the shaving cream running down into the towel at his collar. The barber's hand stilled immediately. Concern colored his professional tone. "Sir, are you all right? Did I cut you?" Marcus drew breath through constriction in his chest. His voice emerged thick, unfamiliar. "I'm fine." Another breath. "Keep going." The barber hesitated, then continued with even greater care. Marcus let the tears fall, grieving the man he'd been, mourning the family that existed only in photographs and dreams that still woke him at 3 in the morning, saying goodbye to the version of himself that had believed punishment was what he deserved. When they finished, they handed him a mirror. The face looking back belonged to a stranger. Sharp jawline emerged from beneath where beard had hidden bone structure. High cheekbones, slightly hollow but carrying the ghost of handsomeness. His eyes, still tired, still carrying weight, held something new. A spark, sliver of hope, hint of life that hadn't existed this morning when he'd woken on the narrow bed in his studio apartment. Marcus raised a trembling hand to touch his own face. Smooth skin felt foreign under his fingertips. The tactile memory of stubble had become so familiar, its absence created dissonance. Was this him, or just the shadow of who he used to be? An employee approached carrying new clothes on hangers. White dress shirt, tailored black trousers, cognac, leather shoes that looked hand-stitched. Victoria had guessed his size correctly. Of course she had, because women who built billion-dollar companies didn't leave details to chance. Marcus stared at the clothes for a long moment. The last time he'd worn anything like this was at the funeral. 5 caskets lined up in a church while rain hammered the roof, and he'd stood alone in a black suit, unable to cry because he'd already emptied himself of tears. Unable to speak because his throat had locked tight around grief, too massive for language. Unable to do anything except stand motionless while they lowered everyone he'd loved into cold Massachusetts ground. He took a breath, pushed the memory down into the place where all the other memories lived, caged and hungry. Then he stepped into the changing room. The clothes fit perfectly. The shirt's fabric felt like water against skin used to cheap cotton. The trousers hung with the effortless drape that came from actual tailoring instead of off-the-rack guesswork. The shoes, he stood in them and felt like someone pretending to be the person he'd been a decade ago before loss carved him hollow. Marcus emerged from the changing room. Victoria had been sitting in one of the waiting area's chairs, scrolling through her phone. She looked up. Her eyes widened, lips parted slightly. The calculated corporate mask slipped entirely, revealing genuine surprise underneath. Where a shabby janitor had entered 90 minutes ago, someone else now stood. A man who looked like he belonged in boardrooms and first-class lounges. Someone whose intelligence showed in his eyes instead of being hidden beneath layers of deliberate invisibility. Victoria's voice came soft, almost to herself. "This is the man I saw." Marcus stood, uncertain, hands hanging awkward at his sides. Every instinct screamed that he didn't belong in these clothes, in this body, in this impossible situation. But another part, the part that had survived 5 years of wanting to stop existing, whispered that maybe impossibly he did. The words fell out before he could stop them. I feel like he paused, searching for language adequate to the strangeness. Like I just stepped out of a grave. Victoria rose from her chair. Her smile carried understanding that went beyond sympathy into something more complex, recognition possibly of what it meant to rebuild yourself from wreckage. You haven't seen anything yet. She gestured toward the door. Come on. They returned to the Bentley. The drive continued through Boston as afternoon light slanted golden across glass towers and historic architecture. Marcus watched the city slide past familiar streets, transformed by the surreal lens of everything that had happened in the last 3 hours. The Bentley slowed, then stopped. Marcus looked up. Iron gates opened onto a circular driveway lined with maple trees, showing the first colors of autumn. Beyond them rose a white mansion with expansive glass facades that caught and held the dying sun. Modern architecture merged with classical New England sensibility, clean lines and columns, tradition updated by someone with both money and taste. A fountain centered the courtyard, water arcing in graceful parabolas. The kind of house that appeared in architectural magazines. The kind of wealth that didn't announce itself through ostentation, but through perfect execution of every detail. Marcus's voice emerged barely above a whisper, "This is your house." Victoria's response carried gentle amusement. "This is our house now." The words hit him with fresh unreality. Our house, as if marriage to a stranger came with property transfers, as if he belonged anywhere near this kind of life. They stepped out. The air smelled different here, cleaner, carrying hints of expensive landscaping and the particular quiet that came from neighborhoods where old money and new tech money learned to coexist. Marcus followed Victoria up stone steps to double doors that probably cost more than his entire year's salary. Inside, the foyer opened into spaces that seemed designed to showcase both wealth and restraint. High ceilings, hardwood floors that gleamed under recessed lighting, abstract art on walls, actual art not prints, because the brushstrokes showed texture, and the signatures in the corners belonged to names he vaguely recognized from museum visits years ago with Elena. A faint scent of vanilla and lavender hung in the air. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock chimed softly. Then came the sound of small feet on stairs. A girl appeared at the landing, rubbing sleep from her eyes. 5 years old, maybe 6, with curly brown hair that caught light in ways that suggested careful genetics. She wore pajamas printed with cartoon characters. Elsa from that movie Emma had loved, the one they'd watched together 17 times before the world ended. The girl's voice carried the particular clarity of children who hadn't learned self-consciousness yet. "Mom, who is that?" Victoria opened her arms. The smile that transformed her face showed something Marcus hadn't seen before: uncomplicated love, the kind that existed outside quarterly reports and board meetings. "Chloe, come down and say hello, sweetheart." The girl Sophie, Victoria had called her Sophie, descended the stairs with the careful attention of someone navigating an important social situation. She reached her mother and wrapped arms around Victoria's waist, then turned to study Marcus with the frank assessment children employed before learning politeness. Victoria's hand rested on her daughter's shoulder. "This is my friend Marcus. He'll be staying with us from now on." Sophie's examination continued, serious and thorough. Marcus recognized the look. Emma had deployed similar scrutiny when evaluating new babysitters or teachers. Children possess built-in authenticity detectors that adults spent years training themselves to ignore. Finally, Sophie spoke, "Are you a good person?" The question landed with unexpected weight. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. He lowered himself to one knee, bringing himself to eye level with this small human whose opinions suddenly mattered more than any board of directors. His answer came honest because lying to children felt like a worse sin than most others. "I'm trying." Sophie considered this. Her head tilted slightly, curls shifting across her shoulder. Then she nodded with the same decisive movement her mother had used in accepting his ring challenge in the parking lot. "Then you can stay." A pause. "But you're not allowed to tell ghost stories at night." "Okay." Something broke loose in Marcus's chest. Laughter, actual laughter, escaped before he could stop it. The sound felt foreign, like speaking a language he'd forgotten existed. When was the last time he'd laughed, really laughed, not the bitter approximation he'd learned to substitute? "I promise." Sophie smiled, apparently satisfied with the negotiation. She turned back to Victoria. Can I show him my room? Victoria glanced at Marcus, eyebrow raised in question. He nodded, still kneeling, still processing the fact that a 5-year-old had just given him permission to exist in her space. That night, Victoria arranged for Marcus to sleep in a guest room on the second floor. A housekeeper named Martha appeared with practiced efficiency, bringing dinner on a tray, roast beef cooked to perfect medium, rare mashed potatoes with actual butter, steamed vegetables that hadn't come from a can. The kind of meal Marcus had stopped believing existed outside of memory. He ate slowly, savoring each bite. When had he last tasted food instead of simply consuming calories for survival? The flavors registered as almost painful in their richness, his palate recalibrating to abundance after years of deliberate deprivation. Afterward, he stepped onto the balcony attached to the guest room. Boston spread before him in every direction, lights glittering like an inverted constellation, the city alive with motion and meaning. From this height, everything looked manageable, comprehensible, the kind of view that came with believing you could control outcomes through intelligence and effort. Marcus had stopped believing that particular lie the morning he watched television in a conference room and saw a flight number that meant everything ended. The balcony door opened behind him. Victoria appeared carrying 2 glasses of wine condensation already beating on the crystal. She handed him one without asking if he wanted it, then settled into the chair beside him. Together they sat in the silence watching the city breathe. Finally, Victoria spoke. Her voice had shed the boardroom authority, leaving something more vulnerable underneath. Now tell me, who are you, Marcus Chen? The question hung in the evening air. Marcus stared at his hands for a long time, the calluses, the scars, the ring that still felt like it belonged to someone else's story. Every instinct told him to deflect, to offer the abbreviated version people used at parties when discussing anything real might make others uncomfortable. But something about the hour or the wine or the fact that this woman had knelt in front of him in a parking lot made evasion feel like cowardice. His voice came low, carrying weight accumulated over 5 years of silence. That's a long story. Victoria's response held infinite patience. I have all night. Marcus drew breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs, preparing to dive into depths he'd spent years avoiding. Then he began, My name is Marcus Chen, and you're right, I wasn't always just a janitor. The words emerged slowly at first, each one carefully chosen like someone navigating a minefield of memory. He told her about MIT, about the PhD in data science he'd earned at 27, about McKinsey, Google, Microsoft names that opened doors and commanded respect in the world Victoria inhabited, about TED Talks and Harvard Business Review articles and consulting fees that seemed obscene until you realized how much value the right algorithm could generate. I had everything a man could dream of. The statement came without bitterness, just observation. Career money recognition. A pause. And then I had something better. Victoria listened without interrupting, the city lights reflected in her eyes, patient and still. Marcus continued. Elena, my wife, we met at a tech conference in San Francisco. Even saying her name hurt like pressing on a bruise that never fully healed. She was a software engineer at Google's Boston office. Brilliant mind, the kind of person who could hold an entire system architecture in her head and spot the single line of code that would break everything. He paused, gathering himself. But what made me fall in love was her laugh. She had this way of finding joy in stupid things. Bad puns, terrible movies, the first snow of winter. His voice roughened. It could make me forget everything else existed. They'd married young, 29 for him, 26 for her. Bought a house in Newton that needed work but had good bones and a backyard where they could imagine children playing someday. Emma came first. Marcus's hands tightened on the wine glass. She was 8 when he stopped, swallowed, started again. 8 years old, looked exactly like her mother. Same eyes, same smile. She loved Harry Potter, read the entire series by herself before 2nd grade. The memory arrived sharp and immediate. Emma curled in the reading chair by the window. Afternoon sun painting her hair gold, completely absorbed in a world of wizards and magic, while real life continued around her, ordinary and precious in its mundanity. Noah was 5. Total opposite, couldn't sit still for more than 30 seconds. All energy and mischief. Despite everything, affection colored the words. One smile from him, and the whole family melted. Marcus took a drink of wine. The alcohol burned pleasantly, grounding him in the present, even as the past pulled with gravitational force. My parents lived with us. Dad had been a math professor at Boston University before retiring. Mom was a nurse. They wanted to be close to the grandkids, so we converted the first floor into a suite for them. He could see it clearly. His mother in the kitchen, teaching Emma to make dumplings, his father helping Noah with puzzles, the house always full of voices and laughter, and the comfortable chaos of family. Victoria's voice came gentle. That sounds perfect. It was. Two words flat and final. Perfectly ordinary. Chaotic mornings and bedtime stories and arguments about homework. I had no idea I'd never see any of it again. The night air felt suddenly colder. Marcus set down the wine glass because his hands had started shaking. December 5 years ago, we planned a winter vacation in Aspen. The whole family, Elena, the kids, my parents. Emma was excited about learning to ski. Noah kept asking if there would be snowmen. The details remained crystalline, preserved in memory like insects in amber. I had a meeting that morning, important client from DC, the kind of meeting you couldn't reschedule. He heard his voice continue as if from a distance, recounting facts that still felt unreal despite their undeniable truth. The rushed breakfast, Noah spilling milk and crying, Emma arguing with her grandmother about how many books she could bring, Elena in the red coat he'd given her for her birthday telling him not to let work make him forget the trip. I was staring at my phone, checking emails. The confession emerged hollow. Didn't even look at her when I kissed her goodbye. Just a quick peck on the cheek, absent-minded. The taxi had arrived. They'd all piled in 5 people, 5 suitcases, 5 lives heading toward an airport in a vacation that would never happen. Emma ran to the door, called out, "Bye, Dad," and his voice cracked. I just waved, didn't step closer, didn't hug her. Noah was still crying about the milk, and I didn't even walk over to comfort him. I just let them leave. Victoria's hand moved slightly as if to reach for him, then stopped. Marcus forced himself to continue. The flight took off at 9 from Logan Airport, United 1892 to Denver. The numbers were seared into his brain with the permanence of scar tissue. At 9:47, while the plane was at 35,000 feet over Pennsylvania, there was a technical failure. Lost control. He stopped, drew breath, said the words that never got easier. It crashed into the Allegheny Mountains. No survivors. 157 people dead. A pause that contained universes. 5 of them were mine. The silence stretched. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. Victoria's face showed no shock. She must have researched this, found the news stories, confirmed what her instincts told her about why a PhD from MIT ended up sweeping floors. I found out from the television. The memory played with the clarity of trauma. Conference room, 10:15, getting ready to present to the DC client. Someone turned on the breaking news. I looked up and saw the flight number. He'd screamed, smashed his laptop against the table, collapsed onto the floor while colleagues shouted and called for help. The rest existed only in fragments. The ambulance, the hospital, the doctor's careful professional sympathy as he confirmed what the television had already made inevitable. They took me to the morgue. Marcus's voice had gone flat, affect, stripped away to reveal bare structure underneath. To identify the bodies. The plane fell from 35,000 feet, so they weren't. He stopped. Started again. I had to identify them by what was left. Elena's wedding ring, Emma's bracelet she'd made from pink plastic beads, Noah's teddy bear, my father's watch. The funeral happened on a day when rain turned the world gray. 5 caskets, each one a physical impossibility, a wooden box containing someone who should still be breathing and laughing and complaining about minor inconveniences. I stood there alone. Couldn't cry anymore because I'd already emptied out. Couldn't speak because my throat was locked. He looked at Victoria directly for the first time since starting the story. Couldn't do anything except stand there and understand that I'd chosen work over saying I love you, over hugging my children goodbye, over being present in the last moment I'd ever have with them. Victoria's eyes glistened. Tears tracked slowly down her face, but she stayed quiet, letting him finish. After the funeral, I couldn't go back to that house. Everything reminded me. Dad's chair, Mom's corner of the kitchen where she made tea every morning, Emma's room full of stuffed animals, Noah's toy cars scattered across the floor like he'd just stepped away and might come back any second. So he'd started drinking. One glass became two, became a bottle, became the only way to sleep without dreaming about plane crashes and unopened Christmas presents and all the futures that died in Pennsylvania mountains. Lost my job a year later. Lost the house 6 months after that when I couldn't make payments anymore. The descent from there followed predictable trajectories, wandering sleeping in his car until the car got repossessed, then parks and shelters and the grinding mathematics of survival on the margins. 3 years ago, I saw the hiring sign at Fresh Value. They needed a janitor hour, didn't ask questions, didn't care about gaps in employment history, just needed someone willing to work for minimum wage and show up on time. Marcus looked out at the Boston skyline, all those lights representing lives continuing without him. So I took it, not to rebuild, not to start over, just to exist, to occupy space until whatever was supposed to happen next finally happened. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small box worn at the edges from years of handling. Inside lay a single photograph, the family portrait they'd taken the previous Christmas, everyone smiling at the camera with the oblivious happiness of people who believed they had decades ahead of them. Marcus handed the photo to Victoria. She studied it in silence, her tears falling more freely now. "This is the only thing I have left." His voice had gone hoarse. Everything else got sold, or lost, or didn't matter enough to keep. Victoria looked up from the photograph. Her own pain showed clearly now, the careful professional mask completely abandoned. "I understand that pain, Marcus." The words came thick with emotion. "I lost my parents in a car crash 10 years ago. They were on their way home from a concert, their 30th wedding anniversary. Drunk driver on I-90. She drew a shaking breath. "The last conversation I had with my mother, I snapped at her for reminding me not to work too late. Never got to say I love you one more time." Marcus watched her face as she continued. "And James, my husband, Sophie's father, he was diagnosed with glioblastoma when Sophie was 18 months old. Brain cancer, aggressive." Her voice cracked. "He chose to do treatment in Houston at MD Anderson because he didn't want Sophie to see him getting sicker, wanted her to remember him healthy." The tears came faster. "He died 6 months later. Sophie was 2. She doesn't remember him. I have to show her photos and tell her stories about a man she'll never really know." They sat in silence, broken only by the distant hum of the city. Two people who'd lost everything that mattered sitting on a balcony above Boston, trying to figure out if the wreckage could be rebuilt into something new. Victoria's voice emerged steadier now. "I had to keep living for Sophie, for myself, had to prove that building a company and making money and achieving everything my parents dreamed for me could somehow make up for all the conversations we never had." Marcus looked at her with new understanding. This wasn't charity. This wasn't a billionaire's whim. This was two survivors recognizing each other across the debris field of their respective losses. "You're a true warrior," he said quietly. Victoria smiled through tears. "So are you. You just haven't realized it yet." They fell silent again, but this time the quiet felt different. Less like two strangers occupying adjacent space, and more like two people beginning to understand they might need each other in ways neither had anticipated. Marcus felt something shift in his chest. For the first time in 5 years, he didn't just feel alive in the technical sense of having a pulse and drawing breath. He wanted to keep living, wanted to see what happened next, wanted to believe that maybe impossibly there existed futures worth experiencing. The thought terrified him more than the emptiness had. Morning arrived with birdsong. Marcus hadn't noticed existed. Sunlight filtered through curtains he'd forgotten to close, warming the guest room in gradual increments. For several minutes he lay motionless, listening. The quality of silence here differed from his studio apartment, thicker, more expensive, insulated from the city's grinding machinery by wealth and distance. The smell of coffee drifted up from somewhere below, real coffee, not the instant crystals he'd learned to tolerate. His stomach clenched with hunger that felt almost forgotten, the body remembering what actual appetite meant instead of the hollow need for calories. A knock rattled the doorframe. Sophie's voice came muffled but enthusiastic through the wood. Good morning, Marcus. Mom says to come down for breakfast. There are pancakes. Marcus sat up too quickly, head spinning slightly. The diamond ring caught morning light throwing fractured rainbows across his hand. Still there. Still real. Yesterday hadn't been exhaustion-fueled hallucination. He found his voice. Good morning, Sophie. I'll be right down. Her footsteps thundered away with the volume only children achieved, announcing everything through movement and noise. Marcus stood, bones protesting slightly. The guest bed had been too soft, his body accustomed to the thin mattress and broken springs of poverty. The bathroom mirror showed him the stranger from yesterday. Clean-shaven face, trimmed hair, eyes that looked marginally less hollow. He splashed water, brushed teeth with the new toothbrush Martha had left on the counter, tried to recognize himself. Downstairs, the dining room table held enough food for a small battalion. Golden pancakes stacked high eggs prepared 3 different ways. Crispy bacon arranged on ceramic platters. Fresh fruit cut into precise geometric shapes. Orange juice in a glass pitcher that caught light and turned it amber. Victoria sat at the head of the table wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than Marcus's entire wardrobe used to. Sunlight from the tall windows illuminated her profile as she reviewed something on her tablet. Sophie occupied the adjacent seat, already working through her pancake stack with the focused determination of the very young. Victoria looked up. A smile crossed her face, genuine warmth instead of the corporate mask she'd shown the world for decades. Good morning. Marcus lowered himself into the chair across from her, feeling like an actor who'd wandered onto the wrong stage. The impulse to apologize for existing pressed against his throat. Good morning. Victoria set down the tablet with decisive finality. Eat, you'll need the energy. The words triggered immediate wariness. Marcus reached for a pancake, movements careful. Why? Her response came as casual as discussing weather. Because today you start working at Apex Technologies. The fork clattered against his plate. Marcus's chest tightened, air suddenly difficult to process. I've been out of the industry for 5 years. Technology changes every day. Algorithms I knew are obsolete, frameworks I learned don't exist anymore. Victoria's expression shifted into something he recognized from business profiles. The look she deployed when board members questioned her judgment. Confident without being dismissive, certain without arrogance. Then you'll relearn. What made you capable hasn't disappeared. The core skills are still there. Pattern recognition, analytical thinking, problem solving under constraints. She paused, letting the words settle. You just need someone to believe in you. Marcus looked down at his hands. Calluses from 3 years of janitorial work marked his palms. Under the manicured nails, faint dirt still lingered in the cuticles. These weren't the hands of someone who belonged in boardrooms. His voice emerged barely audible. I don't know if I'm ready. Victoria reached across the table. Her hand covered his warm, steady, real. I know, and I believe in you. That's enough. The Apex Technologies headquarters rose 50 stories into Boston's skyline, all glass and chrome, and the architectural confidence that came from having nothing to prove. Inside felt like entering a different dimension where everyone moved with purpose, where every conversation carried the weight of decisions that affected millions of users and billions in revenue. Marcus walked through the lobby beside Victoria, acutely aware of eyes tracking their movement. Whispers followed in their wake, not quite loud enough to parse individual words, but unmistakable in intent. Speculation, judgment, curiosity sharpened into gossip. A young woman in expensive athleisure wear leaned toward her colleague. Who is that? The response came sotto voce but clear enough. I've never seen him before. Is he her new partner? They took the elevator to the executive floor. The ascent happened in silence except for the barely perceptible hum of machinery moving them upward through space and social hierarchy. Marcus watched floor numbers climb, each digit another layer of separation from the ground-level reality he'd inhabited for years. The doors opened onto a corridor lined with abstract art and floor-to-ceiling windows. Victoria led him to a corner office whose door stood open in apparent expectation. Inside, space unfolded with the careful geometry of expensive interior design, mahogany desk, positioned to maximize the panoramic view of Boston leather chairs that looked designed for comfort and authority, in equal measure bookshelves holding technical volumes and industry awards. On the desk sat a carved elegant script on heavy stock. Welcome, Mr. Marcus Chen, Director of Strategic Data Analytics. Marcus stopped in the doorway. His brain struggled to process the disconnect between the title and the person he'd been yesterday, this morning, every day for the past 5 years. This is for me. Victoria moved past him into the office, turning to face him with expression that suggested the question was unnecessary. As of today, your Apex is Director of Data Analytics. You report directly to me. The words should have felt like validation. Instead, they amplified the imposter syndrome screaming through his nervous system. Marcus's voice came out strained. My resume has a 5-year gap where I was invisible. Who's going to respect someone who has no recent work history? The smile Victoria gave him carried edges. I'm the CEO. I have authority to hire anyone I believe will add value to this company. A pause calculated for emphasis. And I don't answer to anyone about my hiring decisions. The first leadership meeting happened 3 hours later. Marcus sat at a conference table surrounded by executives whose combined net worth probably exceeded several small nations. They wore their success casually expensive watches, tailored suits, the particular confidence that came from never doubting their right to occupy expensive real estate. Victoria made introductions with efficient professionalism. Chief Financial Officer David Morrison, Chief Technology Officer Sarah Kim, VP of Operations James Rodriguez, Chairman of the Board Richard Chen, no relation to Marcus, despite the shared surname. David Morrison studied Marcus with undisguised skepticism. Late 40s silver touching his temples, eyes that calculated value propositions with the speed of high-frequency trading algorithms. His question came pointed, designed to expose weakness. Excuse me, Miss Sterling. The formality carried its own message about hierarchy and boundaries. But who exactly is Mr. Chen? I can't find any professional record of him over the past 5 years. The room's attention converged on Marcus like spotlights. Silence pressed against eardrums, expectant and hostile in equal measure. Marcus drew breath. Every instinct screamed to deflect, to offer the sanitized version that might preserve dignity. But Victoria had knelt in front of him on dirty pavement, had brought him into her home, and given him her daughter's trust. Lying now with dishonor that would reduce her faith to something transactional and calculating. He stood. The chair scraped against floor loud in the waiting quiet. For the past 5 years, I've been a janitor at a suburban Boston supermarket. The conference room erupted in whispers. David Morrison's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. Sarah Kim's expression cycled through surprise and confusion. Only Richard Chen remained impassive, watching with the patient attention of someone who'd learned to wait for complete information before rendering judgment. David's voice carried barely concealed contempt. A janitor, Marcus met his gaze directly. Before that, I earned a PhD in data science from MIT. I consulted for Google, Microsoft, and Goldman Sachs. Published in Harvard Business Review. Gave a TED Talk that has over 2 million views. The whispers quieted, slightly recalibrating assumptions. 5 years ago. His voice caught momentarily, then steadied. I lost my wife, my 2 children, and my parents in a plane crash. United Flight 1892 over Pennsylvania. The silence that followed carried different weight now. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Sarah Kim's expression softened into something approaching sympathy. David Morrison's skepticism wavered, uncertainty creeping around the edges. Marcus continued, each word costing more than the last. I lost everything. Not just family, but the will to keep living. I spent 5 years trying to disappear because existing felt like punishment I deserved. He paused, gathering himself. Miss Sterling gave me a second chance when every logical reason said she shouldn't, when everything about our circumstances suggested this was insane. His eyes found Victoria across the table. And I will spend every day proving she wasn't wrong. The meeting continued, but the energy had shifted. David Morrison asked fewer pointed questions. The other executives treated Marcus with cautious neutrality instead of outright dismissal. Not acceptance yet, but the possibility of eventual credibility. Afterward, walking back to his new office, Marcus felt the weight of institutional doubt pressing against his shoulders. These people had spent years earning their positions through demonstrated competence. He'd arrived through what they probably viewed as nepotism, or worse, a billionaire's romantic whim given organizational authority. The first month unfolded as systematic confrontation with obsolescence. Marcus arrived before dawn, left after dark, spent the hours between drowning in documentation for frameworks and libraries that hadn't existed during his previous life. Python had evolved. TensorFlow and PyTorch had become industry standard. Cloud architecture operated on principles that made his old knowledge feel like studying Latin to understand modern Italian, useful for etymology, insufficient for conversation. His office became a monastery dedicated to relearning everything. Monitors displayed tutorials and technical documentation, notebooks filled with syntax and architectural diagrams. Coffee cups accumulated like archaeological layers marking the passage of exhausting days. The younger employees, bright kids fresh from Stanford and Carnegie Mellon, offered help with the careful politeness reserved for elderly relatives struggling with smartphones. Their patience felt worse than contempt, a reminder that he'd aged out of relevance while sweeping floors and trying not to think about the futures that died in Pennsylvania. Some mornings Marcus sat staring at code that might as well have been encrypted, feeling the familiar pull toward giving up, walking away, returning to the simplicity of janitorial work where expectations never exceeded his capacity to meet them. Then he'd remember Victoria kneeling on asphalt, the absolute certainty in her voice when she said she believed in him. The thought of betraying that faith felt worse than the struggle to rebuild competence from foundation upward. Gradually, so slowly he almost didn't notice, instincts began returning. The analytical frameworks he'd developed during his PhD proved transferable even when specific implementations had changed. Pattern recognition operated independently of programming languages. The core logic of data architecture remained constant beneath surface-level evolution. By week 3, Marcus started seeing inefficiencies in Apex's systems. Small things, initially database queries that could be optimized, API calls, making redundant trips, caching strategies that wasted resources. He made notes uncertain whether pointing out problems would demonstrate value or presumption. Home life presented different challenges. Sophie maintained careful distance, polite but guarded. She answered his questions with monosyllables, accepted his presence with the resignation children show toward unwanted changes in familiar routines. Bedtime on the 4th night, Marcus heard Sophie's voice through the door when he approached to offer reading a story. Victoria was already there sitting on the bed's edge. Sophie's tone carried the particular conviction of the very young, "I don't want him to read. I want you." Victoria started to respond, but Marcus raised a hand, catching her attention through the doorway. He stepped back quietly, retreating before Sophie could register his presence. The rejection shouldn't have hurt. He was a stranger inserted into her life without consultation, another adult promising stability in a world that had already taught her promises meant nothing permanent. But it hurt anyway. He stood in the hallway listening to Victoria's voice reading about princesses and dragons, feeling the weight of being unwanted in a house that wasn't his, in a life he hadn't earned. The whisper came just before Victoria closed the book. "Mom, is he my new dad?" Marcus's breath stopped. "I don't want a new dad. I want my old dad to come back." The words landed like physical blows. Marcus pressed one hand against the wall, steadying himself against the floor that seemed to shift beneath his feet. Of course she wanted James. Of course this interloper with his tragic backstory and uncertain future couldn't replace the father who'd existed in photographs and stories perfect, because death made him immune to human failing. A week passed. Sophie's distance remained constant, a small, human-shaped reminder that not all damage could be fixed by believing hard enough. Marcus stopped trying to engage, directly gave her space to adjust on whatever timeline her 5-year-old psyche required. Then came the night Sophie refused to come down for dinner. Victoria knocked on her door repeatedly, received only silence in response. After the 3rd attempt, she looked at Marcus with worry creasing her forehead. "Something's wrong." Marcus climbed the stairs. His knock came gentle, barely audible. "Sophie, may I come in?" Silence stretched, then small and reluctant. "Okay." He entered carefully, moving like someone approaching a frightened animal. Sophie sat on her bed, hugging a pillow, face hidden against fabric printed with characters from movies he didn't recognize. Her shoulders trembled with suppressed emotion. Marcus lowered himself to the floor, sitting cross-legged to bring his eye level below hers. Less threatening that way, less like an adult imposing authority. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" The pillow muffled her response into incomprehensibility. Marcus waited patient, offering presence without pressure. Sometimes silence created space for truth that questions couldn't reach. Finally, Sophie lifted her face. Tears streaked her cheeks, eyes red from crying. The words burst out with the force of long-suppressed grief. Why did my dad leave me? Why didn't he love me enough to stay? Understanding hit Marcus with the clarity of lightning. Sophie didn't know James had died of cancer. Victoria must have told her something simpler, something a 2-year-old could process. Daddy went to heaven. Daddy isn't coming back. But children constructed their own narratives from available information, and Sophie had concluded she'd been abandoned deliberately. Marcus chose words carefully, aware this moment could shatter or strengthen whatever fragile connection existed between them. I don't know exactly what happened with your father. Honesty first always. But I know one thing absolutely, the fact that he left was never your fault. Sophie's face crumpled. Fresh tears came harder, her small body shaking with arms that seemed too large for her frame. Marcus moved to the bed, wrapped arms around her, felt her cling with desperate intensity. But I miss him so much. I miss him terribly, even though I can't remember what he looks like except in pictures. Marcus's own throat closed around emotion. He understood that particular grief, missing people who existed more in imagination than memory, mourning relationships that never got the chance to fully form. I understand. He kept his voice low, steady. I miss people I love too. Miss them so much it feels like my chest is being crushed sometimes. He gently placed one hand over Sophie's heart palm, flat against her small rib cage. But here's what I learned. They're still here, right here in our hearts. The people we love don't really leave as long as we remember them and carry them with us. Sophie's crying gradually subsided into hiccuping breaths. She pulled back slightly, looking up at Marcus with eyes that seemed older than 5 years should allow. Uncle Marcus. Yes, can I? She hesitated, searching for courage. Can I call you Dad? The question detonated something in Marcus's chest. Emma's voice echoed across years, calling him Daddy, with the same inflection, the same trust that he would always be there to answer. Except he hadn't been there when it mattered, had chosen a meeting over the last. Goodbye had failed the most important people in his life through the simple arithmetic of misplaced priorities. His voice emerged rough, barely controlled. If you want to, that would make me very happy. Sophie's smile broke through remaining tears like sun through storm clouds. She threw arms around his neck, holding tight with the uncomplicated affection children offered when they decided someone was safe. Then, Dad, I'm hungry. Marcus laughed despite the tears streaming down his own face now, the sound mixing joy and grief in proportions he couldn't parse. Let's go eat, my daughter. They descended the stairs together, Sophie's hand in his, and something fundamental shifted. Not replacing James' replacement was impossible and undesirable, but creating new space-building connection that honored the past while allowing for futures neither of them had anticipated. 1 month after starting at Apex, Marcus requested a slot in the upcoming board meeting. David Morrison's email response dripped with barely concealed skepticism. Sure, we'd love to hear what insights a month's work has generated, but Richard Chen approved the agenda addition without comment. The boardroom held 24 people representing billions in shareholder value. Marcus stood at the head of the table, laptop connected to the presentation screen, pulse hammering against his ribs in rhythms that felt like panic. Victoria sat near the back, expression carefully neutral. This was his moment to prove competence independent of her faith. Success or failure would be entirely his. I've spent the past month analyzing Apex's operational data from the last 3 years. His voice came steadier than expected, muscle memory from hundreds of presentations reasserting itself beneath the rust. And I found a pattern nobody's noticed. He clicked. The screen filled with graphs showing cloud resource allocation across time, colored lines representing different server clusters and their utilization rates. We're paying for approximately 40% more capacity than we actually use. Another click brought up cost analysis. Resources sit idle because our provisioning algorithms don't account for realistic load patterns. They were designed for worst-case scenarios that occur less than 5% of the time. David Morrison leaned forward, skepticism sharpening into actual attention. What's your proposed solution? Marcus advanced to the next slide, a new algorithmic framework he'd designed over the past 2 weeks, working through nights when sleep wouldn't come anyway. Dynamic allocation based on predictive modeling, machine learning that analyzes historical patterns and adjusts capacity in real time. He walked them through the technical architecture fielding questions about implementation complexity and transition risk. The room's energy shifted incrementally, skepticism giving way to professional interest. The final slide displayed projected savings, $18 million annually, conservative estimate. Silence descended. David Morrison sat back, expression cycling through surprise and reluctant respect. Sarah Kim studied the numbers with narrowed eyes, checking the math. Richard Chen's face remained impassive, but his attention had sharpened into the focus that meant serious consideration. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice carrying the weight of decades building companies. "Where did you source this data, Mr. Chen?" Marcus met his gaze directly. "From Apex's own systems. Everything I analyzed exists in databases you already maintain. I just looked at it from a different angle, asked questions nobody thought to ask." David Morrison found his voice. "This is actually impressive." The words seemed to cost him physical effort. "I'd like to see a detailed implementation plan by next week." Richard Chen nodded slowly. "Agreed. Mr. Chen, this represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need." He glanced at Victoria, something approving in the look. It seems Miss Sterling's judgment was sound after all. The meeting concluded with handshakes and requests for follow-up presentations. Walking back to his office, Marcus felt the first genuine confidence he'd experienced since arriving. Not arrogance, just the quiet satisfaction of demonstrating competence through results instead of credentials. David Morrison caught up with him in the corridor. The CFO's expression had softened from contempt into something approaching professional respect. "It seems I underestimated you. I apologize." Marcus extended his hand. "That's all right. I underestimated myself too." That night, Victoria waited on the balcony with wine. When Marcus joined her, she turned with a smile that carried unmistakable pride. "You did it." Marcus shook his head slightly. "We did it. You gave me the chance. I just proved it wasn't completely insane." They stood close, the space between them charged with something that had been building since the parking lot proposal. Victoria's eyes searched his face, finding permission in whatever she saw there. She leaned forward. He met her halfway. The kiss started tentatively, two people learning each other's geometry, mapping the territory between grief and possibility. Then it deepened into something more certain, more necessary. Two souls that had learned love wasn't finite, that opening to new connection didn't erase what had been lost. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing harder. Victoria rested her forehead against his eyes still closed. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks." Marcus's laugh came quiet, intimate. "Me too. I just wasn't sure I deserved to." 2 months after the parking lot proposal, the world discovered their secret. Someone at Fresh Value, a cashier who'd witnessed the proposal and harbored resentment about wealthy people disrupting ordinary life, sold their story to a tabloid. The photos appeared first: Victoria kneeling on dusty pavement, Marcus in his janitor uniform looking stunned, the diamond ring catching light like a flare. The headlines followed within hours, each more sensational than the last. "Billionaire's desperate gamble CEO proposes to homeless janitor." From rags to riches, the Cinderella man of Boston. Victoria Sterling's shocking secret romance revealed. By afternoon, the story had metastasized across every news platform and social media channel. Twitter exploded with takes ranging from cynical to supportive, everyone performing opinions for their particular audience. The hashtag billionaire proposal trended globally within 6 hours. Marcus discovered the coverage when his phone, the new smartphone Victoria had given him, started vibrating with such frequency he thought it was malfunctioning. Notifications cascaded across the screen, alerts about being tagged in posts mentioned in articles dissected by strangers who'd decided his life was public property. The mansion's driveway filled with news vans by evening. Reporters camped outside the gates, cameras trained on the entrance, in hopes of catching footage they could sell to networks hungry for content that combined wealth romance and class transgression. Sophie's school called Victoria with concerns about photographers lingering near the campus. Other parents had questions, uncomfortable with the media attention their children were experiencing by proximity. Apex's stock dropped 8% in 2 trading days. Shareholders demanded explanations. Board members called emergency meetings to discuss the situation without specifying whether situation meant the marriage or the publicity or the erosion of market confidence. David Morrison leveraged the crisis, whispering concerns to Richard Chen during private conversations Marcus wasn't meant to know about. The CFO's argument followed predictable logic. This reflected poorly on Apex's judgment, damaged their reputation among institutional investors who valued stability over romantic gestures. He suggested Marcus step down temporarily just until the media storm passed, and shareholders could be reassured that leadership maintained appropriate boundaries between personal whims and corporate governance. Richard Chen listened without commitment, his expression revealing nothing about where his judgment would land. Victoria's PR team convened in her office, laptops, open phones constantly buzzing with media requests. They presented options with the clinical detachment of doctors discussing treatment for terminal illness. We could deny the relationship is serious. Say you were helping a struggling veteran re-enter society. Victoria's response came flat. Marcus isn't a veteran, and that's a lie. We could frame it as philanthropic, a program to help displaced workers. That reduces him to charity case. No. The PR director, a sharp woman named Jennifer who'd handled crises for Fortune 100 companies, tried a different approach. Then we control the narrative proactively. Press conference. You explain the situation on your terms before the media creates their own story. Victoria looked at Marcus. He'd been sitting quietly through the discussion, watching strategy unfold around him, like observing generals planning a battle where he constituted the disputed territory. What do you think? Marcus considered. Every instinct screamed to hide, to retreat into invisibility where scrutiny couldn't reach him. But hiding now would confirm the skeptic's suspicion that he had something to be ashamed of, that Victoria had made a mistake worth concealing. We tell the truth. His voice emerged stronger than he felt. All of it. Let people judge based on facts instead of speculation. The press conference was scheduled for the following afternoon. Apex's main building media room packed with journalists who'd covered Victoria's rise through the tech industry and now smelled blood in the water. Cameras lined the back wall. Recording devices cluttered every horizontal surface. Victoria and Marcus entered together. She wore a charcoal suit that conveyed authority without ostentation. He'd chosen one of the tailored outfits from the early wardrobe Victoria commissioned, trying to look like someone who belonged beside a CEO instead of someone playing dress-up with borrowed legitimacy. They stood behind the podium. Camera flashes created a strobing effect that made Marcus's vision swim. Questions erupted before Victoria could speak, journalists shouting over each other in competition for attention. Victoria raised a hand. The room quieted gradually, discipline reasserting itself beneath professional chaos. Her voice carried clearly through the microphone. Yes, I proposed to Marcus Chen outside a supermarket in Dorchester. Yes, he was working as a janitor at that time. The room erupted again. She waited for silence. What you don't know, what you haven't bothered to research before writing your headlines, is that Marcus holds a PhD in data science from MIT. He consulted for Google, Microsoft, and Goldman Sachs. His work on predictive modeling has been cited in over 300 academic papers. Some journalists looked uncomfortable, realizing they'd missed crucial context. Others simply wrote faster, incorporating new information into whatever narrative they had already constructed. Victoria continued. 5 years ago, Marcus suffered a tragedy that would destroy most people. He lost his entire family in a plane crash. She paused, letting the weight of that settle. He survived. He endured. And when I saw him, I didn't see a janitor. I saw a brilliant mind buried under grief. I saw someone worth saving. Her voice roughened slightly. And I saw someone who could save me too. She stepped back. Marcus moved to the microphone. His hands wanted to shake, but he forced them, still refused to give the cameras that particular image of weakness. I don't expect you to understand our situation. The words emerged clear despite his pulse hammering. I don't need you to approve, but I will not apologize for being given a second chance at life. A reporter in the front row shouted, "Are you marrying her for money?" Marcus looked directly at the camera pointed at him, speaking to the millions who would watch this moment edited and analyzed and dissected. I'm marrying her because she's the first person in 5 years who made me want to live again. Because she saw value in someone everyone else had stopped seeing. Because she took a risk that most people never would. Another voice. What about Apex shareholders? Don't they deserve leadership that maintains professional boundaries? Victoria fielded that one. My personal life doesn't affect my ability to lead this company. Apex's performance over the past decade speaks for itself. A pause calculated for emphasis. Judge me by results, not by headlines designed to generate clicks. A journalist Marcus recognized from Business Cable News. How do you prove this is legitimate and not just a publicity stunt? The question hung in air thick with skepticism and the particular hunger that came from people whose careers depended on finding scandal in ordinary human connection. Marcus met Victoria's eyes. Something passed between them, understanding solidarity, the strange intimacy that developed between people facing judgment together. Victoria's response came measured. Give us 3 months, judge our decisions by their outcomes. If my company suffers, if my leadership falters, if Marcus proves unable to contribute meaningfully to Apex success, then you'll have your answer. The press conference concluded with promises to take no further questions. Marcus and Victoria left through a side exit while journalists shouted follow-ups that would go unanswered. In the car driving home, neither spoke. The silence felt different from their early interactions, not awkward, but exhausted, the quiet of soldiers after battle, wondering if the ground they'd held was worth the cost. Victoria finally broke it. That was harder than quarterly earnings calls. Marcus almost laughed. At least investors care about data. Those reporters just wanted to confirm whatever story they had already decided to write. The media coverage continued for days, but the tone shifted incrementally. Some journalists actually researched Marcus's background, found that TED Talk and academic publications wrote pieces acknowledging complexity beyond the reductive Cinderella narrative. Others doubled down on cynicism, but their voices competed now with alternative interpretations instead of dominating the discourse entirely. Apex's stock stabilized, then began recovering. The 3-month challenge Victoria had issued created a natural deadline, and investors decided to wait for actual results before rendering final judgment. But David Morrison wasn't finished. 2 weeks after the press conference, Marcus's $18 million optimization project went live. The algorithm had been tested, extensively validated by 3 separate engineering teams approved by everyone with relevant technical authority. At 3 a.m. on implementation night, production servers crashed. The entire cloud infrastructure went dark for 3 hours, taking down services for millions of users. Emergency systems failed to activate. Backups didn't trigger. The cascade of failures suggested fundamental architectural problems instead of routine bugs. Marcus got the call at 3:47 a.m. By 4:15, he was in the office pulling logs and trying to understand what had imploded so catastrophically. The engineering team arrived shortly after, faces showing various combinations of panic and recrimination. By dawn, they'd restored services, but the damage extended beyond downtime. Millions in lost revenue. Reputation hit among enterprise clients who depended on reliability. Headlines that practically wrote themselves: Apex's janitor CEO's algorithm crashes entire platform. Emergency board meeting convened at noon. Marcus sat at the conference table feeling exhaustion and déjà vu in equal measure. David Morrison's expression carried vindication, poorly disguised as concern. This is exactly what we feared. The CFO's voice aimed for reasonable but landed closer to smug. Perhaps Miss Sterling's judgment was clouded by personal feelings after all. Richard Chen looked grim. Mr. Chen, this failure occurred in code you designed. What's your explanation? Marcus had spent the morning reviewing every line, checking timestamps, analyzing version control. The discovery he'd made felt impossible, but the evidence was undeniable. I checked the implementation 3 times before deployment. He pulled up his laptop, projecting logs onto the conference room screen. My final review happened at 11 p.m. The code was stable, validated, ready for production. He advanced to the next screen. But these logs show changes made at 2:17 a.m., 4 hours after my final review, and 43 minutes before the crash. The room leaned forward collectively. Marcus highlighted specific lines where critical safety checks had been removed, replaced with logic that would guarantee failure under load. Someone modified the code after I approved it, used administrator credentials to bypass review protocols. He pulled up the access logs. These credentials belonged to David Morrison. The silence that followed carried weight dense enough to collapse atmospheres. Every eye turned toward the CFO. David's face cycled through emotions too quickly to track surprise, anger calculation. That's absurd. Why would I sabotage my own company? Marcus kept his voice level. Because you never believed I belonged here. Because you thought destroying my credibility would prove Victoria made a mistake hiring me. Richard Chen examined the logs, his expression darkening. David, these timestamps are incontrovertible. Either you accessed the system at 2 a.m. or someone used your credentials. Which is it? David's composure cracked. This is a setup. He planted evidence to make me look guilty when his code failed. But the technical team had already verified the audit trail. No evidence of tampering, no indication Marcus had manufactured the logs, just clear documentation of David Morrison accessing production code and introducing fatal flaws. The board moved to closed session. Marcus and Victoria waited outside, neither speaking, both understanding that careers and reputations balanced on whatever judgment emerged from that locked room. 40 minutes later, Richard Chen opened the door. We've reached a decision. David Morrison exited first face carved from stone. He walked past Marcus without acknowledgement, each step echoing down the corridor with finality. Richard addressed Marcus directly. The board accepts that sabotage occurred. David Morrison has been terminated, effective immediately. We owe you an apology, Mr. Chen. Relief flooded through Marcus in waves that made his knees weak. But the victory felt hollow. His algorithm still crashed, production still cost the company millions, even if malice rather than incompetence was the root cause. As if reading his thoughts, Richard continued, We're also approving full deployment of your corrected optimization system. The potential savings justify the risk, and the engineering team confirms the original code was sound. Marcus found himself in Victoria's office after midnight, both too wired to consider sleep. She poured whiskey from a bottle that probably cost more than his entire month's salary used to handed him a glass without asking if he wanted it. That was close. She settled into the chair across from him, exhaustion showing in the subtle sag of shoulders usually held military straight. Marcus stared at the amber liquid, seeing his reflection distorted in the curve of crystal. Maybe they're right. Maybe I bring nothing but chaos. Victoria's response came sharp enough to cut. Don't you dare. Don't you dare give up now. He looked up, startled by the intensity. When I knelt in front of you, did you think this would be easy? No. Did you think people would celebrate us? No. Then why are you surprised when they attack? She leaned forward, gaze locked on his. I didn't propose because I thought you were perfect. I proposed because I saw you fighting to survive, and I needed someone who understood that fight. Marcus felt something crack in his chest. The careful control he'd maintained through the crisis, the professional detachment he'd deployed like armor, all of it fractured under the weight of her absolute certainty. I'm tired, Victoria. So tired of fighting. She moved to kneel in front of his chair, taking both his hands in hers. The reversal of their first meeting wasn't lost on either of them. Then let me fight for you. Just this once. Her voice dropped lower, intimate and fierce. You've been fighting alone for 5 years, but you're not alone anymore. Marcus looked at her, this brilliant, difficult, magnificent woman who'd upended her life and reputation because she believed broken things could be rebuilt. Tears burned in his eyes, but he didn't try to hide them. I miss them so much. The confession emerged raw, pulled from depths he'd tried to seal off. Elena and Manoa, every single day I miss them. I know. And I feel guilty for being happy with you. Victoria's grip tightened on his hands. They would want you to be happy. Love isn't finite, Marcus. Loving me doesn't erase them. He pulled her up into an embrace that felt like drowning and rescue simultaneously. They held each other while he finally let himself cry fully, not silent tears but deep sobs that came from the place where 5 years of grief had calcified into something that felt permanent. Victoria just held him, offering presence without platitudes, understanding without trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. Eventually the crying subsided. Marcus pulled back enough to see her face, both of them tear-stained and exhausted, and somehow more real than they'd been before. Promise me we'll make it. Victoria smiled through her own tears. I promise. 2 weeks later, autumn had settled into Boston with the particular clarity that came before winter's arrival. Marcus arranged dinner on the mansion's rooftop terrace, just the three of them, family in the truest sense, even if the configuration looked nothing like traditional definitions. Sophie helped set the table, chattering about school and friends and the upcoming Halloween costume she'd been planning for weeks. Victoria arrived home early for once, trading her usual late nights for presents with the people who actually mattered. They ate under string lights as the sun set, painting Boston in colors that looked borrowed from better paintings. Conversation flowed easily, the comfortable rhythm of people who'd learned each other's patterns and found them compatible. After dessert, Marcus stood, his chair scraped against stone, the sound drawing both Victoria's and Sophie's attention. "There's something I want to say." Sophie's eyes went wide with the particular excitement children brought to anything that disrupted routine. Victoria set down her wine glass, expression shifting into curiosity. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket, drew out a small velvet box. Sophie actually squealed. He opened the box. Inside lay a platinum ring he'd designed himself, worked with a jeweler to perfect using his first 3 months' salary at Apex. Simple band, etched with 5 small diamonds, arranged in a constellation. Then Marcus lowered himself to one knee. Sophie's hands flew to her mouth. Victoria's eyes widened, lips parting in surprise, despite having engineered the original proposal herself. "7 months ago, you knelt on a dusty sidewalk in front of me." Marcus's voice emerged steady despite his racing pulse. "You gave me a chance I never thought I deserved. You saw something in me I'd stopped seeing in myself." Tears already tracked down Victoria's face, but she stayed silent, letting him finish. "You gave me a new life, a reason to wake up every morning, a family." He glanced at Sophie, who looked ready to explode with excitement. "You and your daughter are everything I need." Deep breath. "I love you. I want to spend the rest of my life becoming worthy of the love you gave me." He lifted the ring. "This time I want to do it the right way. Victoria Sterling, will you be my wife?" The seconds stretched. Victoria's tears came faster, but her smile blazed bright enough to light the darkening evening. "Yes." The word emerged, choked with emotion. "1,000 times yes." Sophie launched from her chair like a rocket, jumping and cheering. "Yay, Mom and Dad are getting married." Marcus slid the ring onto Victoria's finger, the hand that had reached down to pull him from despair that had held his through board meetings and media storms, and quiet moments when grief threatened to drown them both. They embraced while Sophie danced around them, the three of them holding each other on a rooftop above Boston. A family reborn not from conventional origins, but from the harder work of choosing each other, despite every logical reason not to. Two hearts once shattered, finding each other again. Not fixing what was broken, but building something new. From the wedding planning began 2 months before the ceremony, though Victoria insisted on keeping everything deliberately understated. No magazine spreads, no celebrity guests invited purely for social currency, just 80 people who actually mattered, colleagues who'd proven themselves through the crisis, friends who'd stayed silent when silence was loyalty, family on both sides who understood that love looked different for everyone. They chose a church in Cambridge, 3 blocks from MIT, where Marcus had earned credentials that still opened doors despite the years he'd spent invisible. The building carried history in its stone's traditions that predated tech billions and parking lot proposals, offering something permanent against which to measure their improbable present. Sophie took her flower girl responsibilities with the gravity of someone entrusted with national security. She practiced walking up the aisle 17 times, perfecting the pace and the specific angle at which she'd scatter rose petals. Her white dress hung in her closet, wrapped in protective plastic, and she checked on it daily as if it might disappear without constant supervision. Marcus sat in his home office one evening attempting to write vows. The blank document cursor blinked with the rhythm of accusation. How did you summarize transformation in words that wouldn't sound trite? How did you explain to a room full of witnesses that the woman you were marrying had literally pulled you back from the edge of wanting to stop existing? He stared at the old family photograph he'd transferred from the worn box to a proper frame on his desk. Elena smiled out at him, frozen at 30 with all her futures still intact. Aww. Emma and Noah grinned, gap-toothed and immortal in the way children always were before the universe taught them otherwise. Would you want me to be happy? The question emerged into empty air, addressed to people who couldn't answer. Would you forgive me for moving forward? Silence returned only itself, but sitting there in lamplight, Marcus felt something shift. Not closure, that concept implied grief could be resolved like mathematical proofs, problems with definitive solutions. but perhaps acceptance. The understanding that loving Victoria didn't require erasing Elena, that building a future with Sophie didn't dishonor the children who died in Pennsylvania. He could carry both. The weight would never fully leave, but he could learn to walk despite it. The vows came easier after that realization. Not perfect, but honest. And honesty mattered more than eloquence. Victoria faced different struggles. She stood in her bedroom trying on the wedding dress her stylist had commissioned, elegant white silk that managed to suggest tradition without drowning in it. The mirror showed a woman who'd built empires and survived losses and now stood on the edge of promising forever to someone she'd known less than a year. The rational part of her brain, the part that had calculated risk-reward ratios through 1,000 business decisions, whispered warnings. Marcus was still rebuilding. The media still watched their every move with vulture patience. Sophie had accepted him, but children's affections could shift with their developing understanding of the world. Then she thought about Marcus kneeling on the rooftop, offering a ring purchased with money he had earned through competence rather than her generosity. Thought about the way he read to Sophie with voices for different characters, how he'd learned her daughter's complicated preferences and honored them without complaint. How he looked at Victoria like she was miracle and questioned simultaneously someone worth the terrifying vulnerability of opening himself to potential loss again. Love involved risk. She'd learned that watching James deteriorate in Houston holding his hand while cancer devoured the brilliant mind she'd married. But the alternative, insulating yourself from connection to avoid pain, meant dying by inches instead of living fully. Her phone buzzed. A message from Marcus. I finished the vows, I think. Want to read them? Victoria smiled, typing back. Absolutely not. I'll hear them at the altar like everyone else. Fair. I'm nervous. Me too. That's how we know it matters. The night before the wedding, Marcus barely slept. He stood at the bedroom window watching fog roll in from the Atlantic, turning Boston into something ghostly and half real. Tomorrow he'd stand in front of 80 people and promise permanence, despite knowing how easily the universe could revoke everything. Memories surfaced without invitation. The last morning before Elena left for the airport, Noah crying over spilled milk while Marcus checked emails, too distracted to comfort his son properly. Emma calling goodbye from the doorway, receiving only a wave in return instead of the hug she'd deserved. Tears came silently, tracking down his face in familiar paths. This was the grief that never fully departed. Not constant anymore, but returning in waves triggered by anniversaries and transitions and moments when happiness felt like betrayal. Have you forgiven me? The whisper addressed the phone in the darkness and the memory of people who had stopped being able to answer years ago. Are you somewhere watching this? Do you understand I'm trying to honor you by living instead of just existing? The fog offered no response, but standing there, Marcus realized he wasn't asking for permission anymore. Elena couldn't grant absolution for crimes he'd only committed in his own estimation. His family had died in a plane crash caused by mechanical failure, not because he'd chosen one morning meeting over elaborate goodbyes. The guilt was his to carry or release, and maybe impossibly he could choose the latter. 1 week before the ceremony, Marcus received a certified letter at the Apex office. The return address showed a law firm he didn't recognize, the envelope's weight, suggesting substantial documentation inside. He opened it during a brief window between meetings. The first page made his vision swim. McKinsey & Company was suing him for breach of non-compete agreements and intellectual property theft. The complaint alleged that his $18 million optimization algorithm constituted proprietary work developed during his tenure at the consulting firm, that he'd violated contractual obligations by implementing similar systems at Apex Technologies. They were seeking $50 million in damages, plus an injunction preventing Marcus from working in data analytics anywhere in the United States. The document fell from hands that had gone numb. Around him, the office continued its normal operations, people moving through corridors with purpose, phones ringing with the mundane crises of Tuesday afternoon. But Marcus's world had narrowed to the legal language, threatening to destroy everything he'd rebuilt. Victoria found him 20 minutes later, still sitting motionless, the lawsuit spread across his desk like evidence of crimes he didn't remember committing. What's wrong? She crossed to him, immediately reading his expression before he could formulate words. Marcus gestured at the papers. Victoria picked them up, her eyes scanning with the speed of someone who'd read thousands of contracts and legal documents. Her face hardened incrementally as she processed the allegations. This is absurd. The algorithm you designed for Apex bears no resemblance to anything McKinsey has published or patented. They're claiming it's derivative, that the underlying frameworks came from work I did while employed there. Marcus's voice emerged hollow. And technically they're right, I learned those frameworks during my PhD, refined them while consulting. Every data scientist builds on previous knowledge. Victoria pulled out her phone already dialing. I'm calling our legal team. We'll fight this. Within 2 hours, the story had leaked to media outlets that had been waiting for exactly this kind of development. Headlines proliferated across news sites and social platforms, each more damaging than the last. Sterling's fiancé accused of corporate espionage. From janitor to criminal Marcus Chen's alleged theft. Apex Technologies faces $50 million lawsuit over stolen code. The Apex stock price began falling immediately, shedding value with the velocity of faith evaporating. By market close, they'd lost 15%, billions in market capitalization erased because investors believed Marcus had infected Victoria's judgment and compromised her company's integrity. An emergency board meeting convened at 7 p.m. Richard Chen looked grave, the careful neutrality he'd maintained throughout Marcus's employment showing cracks. This is extremely serious. His voice carried no inflection, just factual assessment. If McKinsey's allegations prove accurate, Apex faces catastrophic liability. Not just the lawsuit damages, but loss of client trust, regulatory scrutiny, reputational destruction. Sarah Kim, the CTO, studied printouts of the lawsuit with increasing concern. Even if we win the discovery process, we'll expose our entire technical infrastructure. Competitors will have roadmaps to everything we've built. The board members traded glances, weighted with unspoken consensus. One of them, a venture capitalist who'd been silent through most crises, finally voiced what everyone was thinking. Miss Sterling, we need to discuss whether Mr. Chen remaining at Apex is tenable given these circumstances. Victoria's response came sharp as broken glass. You're asking me to fire my fiancé 1 week before our wedding based on allegations we haven't even verified. We're asking you to protect this company. Richard Chen's tone remained measured, but steel showed underneath. Your personal life is your own business. But when it threatens shareholder value and corporate viability, it becomes board business. The ultimatum arrived without being explicitly stated. Marcus leaves or Victoria faces a no-confidence vote that could remove her from the CEO position she'd spent 15 years building. Give me 2 weeks. Victoria stood, placing both hands flat on the conference table. I helped build this company from 0 revenue to $3 billion in market cap. I've earned the right to defend the man I'm marrying before you force my hand. Silence stretched. Finally, Richard nodded, though his expression suggested this was provisional grace rather than genuine confidence. 2 weeks. If you can't prove his innocence by then, he steps down. Non-negotiable. Marcus and Victoria drove home through Boston traffic that felt surreal in its normalcy. People going about ordinary lives while theirs collapsed into chaos designed by someone who'd decided their existence was worth destroying. I'll withdraw from Apex voluntarily. Marcus stared through the windshield at taillights bleeding into night. Resign tomorrow. That removes the immediate threat to the company. Victoria's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Absolutely not. That's exactly what they want, for you to accept guilt without fighting. McKinsey has infinite resources. They can drag this out for years, bleed us dry through legal fees and discovery costs. Meanwhile, Apex suffers, and Sophie grows up watching her parents fight battles we can't win. So we just surrender. Victoria's voice rose with rare loss of control. Let them destroy you because fighting back is inconvenient. Marcus turned to face her profile illuminated by passing streetlights. I'm not worth this cost. The company matters more than my pride. The Bentley swerved slightly as Victoria pulled to the curb, stopping with enough force that seatbelts engaged. She turned to face him fully, eyes bright with tears that hadn't fallen yet. Don't you dare say you're not worth it. Her voice shook. Don't you dare reduce yourself to a cost-benefit analysis. I'm being realistic. You're being a coward. The words landed like slaps. When I knelt in front of you, you challenged me to prove I meant it. Now I'm challenging you the same way. Do you believe in us or not? Marcus felt something crack in his chest. The careful emotional distance he'd maintained through the crisis, the professional detachment he'd deployed like armor against caring too much, all of it fractured. I believe in you. I'm just terrified of destroying everything you've built. Victoria reached across the console, taking his face in both hands and with fierce gentleness. Then trust me enough to let me decide what's worth fighting for. You've been fighting alone for 5 years, but you're not alone anymore. The echo of words she'd spoken months ago during David Morrison's sabotage. A reminder that some patterns repeated not through failure of imagination, but because certain truths bore reinforcing. That night, Marcus sat in his office reviewing every line of code he'd written for the optimization algorithm. Victoria had hired a forensic team to analyze the work, comparing it against everything McKinsey had published or patented over the past decade. The breakthrough came at 2 in the morning. Marcus remembered his PhD thesis, the foundational research he'd completed before McKinsey ever employed him. He accessed MIT's digital archive, pulled the document he'd defended to a committee of professors in 2014. There on page 73, the exact algorithmic framework McKinsey claimed as proprietary. Marcus had developed it as doctoral research, published it in an academic paper that predated his consulting work by 2 years. McKinsey hadn't owned the methodology. They'd licensed it from him after the fact, used it in client engagements while he worked there. He pulled email archives from a backup drive he'd nearly thrown away years ago. Found correspondence showing McKinsey's technical director explicitly asking permission to use Marcus's published research in their optimization practice. Found his own response granting permission written in the casual language of someone who didn't understand intellectual property law, but trusted his employer to handle things ethically. By dawn, Marcus had assembled a timeline proving McKinsey's lawsuit wasn't just weak, it was retaliatory. Some former partner had recognized Marcus's name in the media coverage, seen an opportunity to destroy someone whose public redemption story made their own mediocrity more visible by contrast. The revenge lawsuit filed by someone whose ego couldn't tolerate seeing a supposed failure succeed. Victoria arrived at the office to find Marcus surrounded by printouts and coffee cups, eyes bloodshot, but expression carrying the first genuine confidence she'd seen since the lawsuit arrived. I can prove it's mine. He walked her through the evidence, the thesis, the emails, the published papers that predated his McKinsey employment. They didn't steal from me exactly, but they sure as hell don't own what they're claiming. Victoria's smile blazed bright enough to rival the sunrise painting Boston's skyline beyond the windows. Then we go nuclear, countersue for frivolous litigation and reputational damages. Make them regret ever putting your name in a filing. The legal team moved with the efficiency that came from defending a case where facts aligned entirely on their side. Within 48 hours, they'd filed a comprehensive response shredding McKinsey's allegations with precision that bordered on surgical. The firm's lawyers called within a day, voices carrying the careful neutrality that meant they'd realized their mistake. We'd like to discuss settlement terms. Victoria's lead counsel, a woman who'd litigated IP cases for 2 decades, responded with predatory calm. We're not interested in settlement. You made public allegations that damaged my client's reputation and threatened his livelihood. We'll see you in court. 48 hours after that, McKinsey withdrew the lawsuit entirely, issued a public statement about misunderstandings based on incomplete information and regret for any inconvenience caused. The media, which had been sharpening knives throughout the crisis, pivoted with characteristic opportunism. Now Marcus became the wrong genius, the target of corporate bullying, the man who'd proven his innocence against powerful adversaries trying to destroy his redemption story. Apex's stock recovered within 3 trading days. Richard Chen sent a personal email to Marcus the firm and apologized for doubting you. Your resilience under pressure demonstrates exactly the qualities we need in leadership. But the victory felt hollow to Marcus. He sat in Victoria's office after the news broke, staring at Boston through floor-to-ceiling windows that had witnessed so many transformations. I came so close to giving up. The confession emerged quiet. Was ready to resign, to walk away from Apex and you and everything we'd built. Victoria moved to stand beside him, both of them looking out at the city that had watched their impossible courtship unfold. But you didn't. You fought. Only because you wouldn't let me quit. That's what love means, Marcus. Refusing to let each other disappear when the world makes disappearing feel easier than staying. He turned to face her, seeing in the afternoon light every decision they'd made together, the risks in the battles and the small, daily choices to believe in something Neither fully understood yet. I don't know what I did to deserve you. You existed. Victoria's smile carried the weight of everything they'd survived. You existed and you didn't give up even when giving up looked like the only logical choice. That's all anyone can really do. Just keep existing until existing becomes living again. The wedding took place on a Saturday in late November, when autumn had surrendered to early winter's first serious cold. Inside the church, warmth radiated from bodies packed into pews, and the particular energy that came from witnessing something people had bet against, but secretly hoped would succeed. Sophie stood at the back in her white dress basket of rose petals, gripped with both hands. She'd practiced this moment obsessively, and now that it arrived, she moved with the solemn precision of someone performing a sacred ritual. Marcus waited at the altar, heart hammering against his ribs in rhythms that felt like panic and hope mixed beyond separation. He wore a charcoal suit tailored specifically for this day, trying to look like someone who belonged in churches, making permanent promises instead of someone still surprised. The universe let him have this. The music shifted, everyone stood, and there was Victoria. She moved up the aisle with Sophie holding her hand, neither rushing nor hesitating, just progressing toward futures they'd chosen despite every logical argument against choosing them. The dress caught light from stained glass windows, transforming her into something that existed between the practical CEO and the woman who'd knelt on dirty pavement because she believed broken people could be rebuilt. When she reached the altar, Sophie released her mother's hand and took her position to the side, grinning so widely her face seemed barely large enough to contain the expression. The minister began with traditional words about love and commitment, but Marcus barely heard them. He was looking at Victoria, seeing the intelligence and vulnerability and stubborn faith that had pulled him back from the edge when he'd stopped believing edges could be retreated from. Then came the vows. Marcus drew breath, steadied himself, and spoke the words he'd written during late nights, wrestling with how to summarize transformation. I, Marcus Chen, take you, Victoria Sterling, to be my wife, in sickness and health, in wealth or poverty, until death parts us. A pause. And beyond that, the addition drew soft laughter from guests who understood the reference. Death had already parted him from people he'd loved, and the fact that he was standing here promising permanence again testified to something more resilient than individual mortality. I promise to always remember that you saw me when I couldn't see myself. I promise to love your daughter as my own. I promise to fight for us even when fighting feels impossible. His voice roughened but held steady, especially when fighting feels impossible. Victoria's tears had already started falling, but her smile showed no weakness, just the particular strength that came from choosing vulnerability after loss had taught you its quality. I, Victoria Sterling, take you, Marcus Chen, to be my husband. I promise to believe in you even when you don't believe in yourself. I promise to be your partner, not your savior. The distinction mattered. Their relationship worked because it wasn't rescue, but mutual recognition. Two people who'd survived different catastrophes and found in each other not completion, but compatible in completeness. I promise to build a life with you, not fix you, because you're not broken. You never were. Her voice dropped lower, intimate, despite the crowd. You were just buried, and I'm honored to help you rise again. They exchanged rings, platinum bands that would age with them, accumulating scratches and stories until their surfaces told histories words couldn't capture. The kiss that sealed everything tasted of salt from shared tears and the particular sweetness that came from promises made when you fully understood how badly promises could end. The church erupted in applause. Sophie jumped and cheered with volume that drew laughter from guests charmed by her unself-conscious joy. Marcus and Victoria walked down the aisle together, no longer separate people but family in the truest sense, not born into connection but choosing it deliberately. The reception took place at the mansion, transformed by florists and caterers into something between garden party and fairy tale. String lights illuminated the backyard tables, held food Victoria had insisted to be excellent without being ostentatious, and music played at volumes that allowed conversation instead of overwhelming it. Richard Chen gave a toast that balanced corporate professionalism with genuine warmth to the most unconventional CEO and the most resilient analyst I've ever met. May your partnership prove as successful in marriage as it's been in transforming Apex. Sophie stole the microphone during dessert, delivering her own toast with the gravity of someone addressing the United Nations. To my new dad who reads me stories and makes pancakes and promised to always stay. I love you. The crowd melted collectively. Marcus had to wipe his eyes before responding to the toast by lifting Sophie into a hug that lasted until she squirmed for release, laughing. During the first dance, Victoria rested her head against Marcus's shoulder while they swayed to music that felt borrowed from another era when promises still seemed like things the universe might honor. We did it. Her whisper barely carried over the song. We survived. His response acknowledged that getting to this moment had required enduring trials neither had anticipated. More than that, she pulled back enough to meet his eyes. We're living, actually living, not just existing through the hours until something changes. 1 week after the wedding, Marcus woke before dawn with the particular clarity that came from decisions made during sleep. He found Victoria already awake reading something on her tablet. I need to visit them. Victoria understood immediately. She set down the tablet expression, shifting into something between sympathy and support. Let me come with you. They drove to Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge as morning light turned the sky from black to gray to the particular blue that suggested winter's arrival. Historic stones stretched in every direction, marking generations of Boston families who'd believed their names would matter longer than granite endured. Marcus's family occupied 5 plots beneath a maple tree that had shed its leaves, leaving bare branches like neural networks against the sky. He carried 5 bouquets purchased from a florist who'd opened early when Victoria called, explained the situation, and offered enough money that opening early became inevitable. He knelt, placing flowers on each grave in silence that felt appropriate for conversations with the dead. Elena's marker showed her name and dates that would never change 35 years, lived entire futures canceled by mechanical failures over Pennsylvania. Marcus's voice emerged rough, unpracticed at addressing people who couldn't answer. I'm sorry it took so long to come back. I'm sorry for every visit I missed, every anniversary I spent trying not to remember instead of honoring what we had. His hand rested on the cold stone. I once believed I didn't deserve to keep living. Thought happiness was betrayal, that moving forward meant forgetting you existed. The confession came easier now, words he'd practiced internally for months finally given voice. But I met someone who showed me I could carry both the grief and the joy, the memory and the future. Victoria stood several feet back, offering presence without intrusion. Her own tears fell silently, understanding intimately what it meant to speak to graves holding people who'd left before you were finished loving them. You'll always be my first love. Marcus's voice cracked but continued. Emma and Noah will always be my children, even though I only got 8 years with one and 5 with the other. Nothing about what I'm building now erases you. He looked up at the bare maple branches, wondering if somewhere beyond observable reality, they could hear him. If forgiveness was something he needed from them, or only from himself. But I want to live now. Want to see what happens next. Want to build something with Victoria and Sophie and whatever futures we manage to create together. Deep breath. I hope that's okay. I hope wherever you are, you're happy I found happiness again. The cemetery offered only wind and the distant sound of traffic. But sitting there on cold ground, Marcus felt the stone that had pressed against his heart for 5 years finally lifting. Not disappearing, the weight would never fully leave, but becoming bearable, transforming from crushing burden into something he could carry while still moving forward. Victoria's hand touched his shoulder. He stood, took her hand, and together they walked back to the car through morning light that made everything look new despite the ancient stones surrounding them. In the car, Marcus turned to Victoria with expression she couldn't quite parse, something between gratitude and fear, and the particular vulnerability of someone who'd just chosen life over merely existing. Thank you for not letting me disappear. Victoria squeezed his hand. Thank you for letting me find you. 6 months after the wedding, Victoria woke feeling nauseous in ways that had nothing to do with food poisoning or seasonal flu. She lay in bed trying to convince herself it was stress or sleep deprivation or anything except the possibility that had occurred to her with increasing insistence over the past 2 weeks. The pregnancy test waited in her bathroom drawer, purchased 3 days ago during a lunch break and hidden like contraband. She'd been too afraid to use it, terrified that hoping would jinx whatever fragile possibility existed. But morning sickness didn't care about her fears. Victoria took the test, sat on the bathroom floor, while minutes stretched into small eternities and watched two lines appear, with the inevitability of futures becoming present. Pregnant, 6 months after marrying Marcus. 41 years old and carrying a child she'd stopped believing her body would produce. She sat there for an hour crying from happiness that felt dangerous in its intensity. James had died before Sophie turned 3. Her parents had died in accidents that gave no warning. Love kept teaching her that permanence was illusion, that the universe specialized in revoking what you'd started believing was secure. But sitting on cold bathroom tile, Victoria chose hope anyway. Chose to believe this pregnancy would result in healthy birth, that Marcus wouldn't die of brain cancer or disappear in plane crashes, that building a family was worth the terror of knowing how badly families could be destroyed. She found Marcus at breakfast, helping Sophie with her homework, while simultaneously reviewing something on his laptop. The domestic scene struck her with force, this life they'd built from wreckage and impossible choices. "I have news." Marcus looked up immediately, reading her expression. "What's wrong?" Victoria crossed to the table, pulled the test from her pocket, set it beside his coffee cup. "Nothing's wrong. Everything's terrifyingly, wonderfully right." His eyes tracked from her face to the test to her face again. Understanding dawned slowly like sunrise that had to fight through clouds. His hand reached for the plastic stick, fingers trembling as he processed what two lines meant. We're, yes, Victoria's voice broke on the word. "We're having a baby." Sophie looked up from her homework, eyes widening as she parsed the adult conversation. "A baby? Really, I'm going to be a big sister." Marcus had gone completely still, tears streaming down his face without apparent awareness they were falling. Victoria watched him cycle through emotions too quickly to track awe and terror, and grief for children he'd lost, and hope for the child they might get to raise together. "I never thought I'd have another child." The confession emerged raw. "Never thought I deserved it." Victoria moved to kneel beside his chair, taking both his hands in hers. "You deserve everything. And if the universe is giving us this chance, I want to take it. Even though it's terrifying. Especially because it's terrifying." Sophie abandoned homework entirely, climbing into Marcus's lap with the confidence of children who'd stopped worrying about rejection. "Can I name the baby?" Marcus laughed through tears, a sound mixing every emotion into something that transcended individual classification. "We'll see, sweetheart." The pregnancy progressed with the particular anxiety that came from being over 40 and having learned intimately that bodies could betray you. Victoria scaled back her hours at Apex, not dramatically, but enough that Richard Chen noticed and approved. Marcus became obsessively protective, monitoring her diet and stress levels with the focus he usually reserved for optimizing algorithms. Sophie talked to Victoria's expanding belly, constantly narrating her days to the sibling who couldn't hear yet, but might someday want to know what had been happening before they arrived. "Hi, baby, this is your big sister. I'm going to teach you everything important, like how to read and which cereals are best and why mom sometimes needs quiet time." Marcus struggled with fears he couldn't articulate fully. Late at night when Victoria was sleeping, he'd stand at the bedroom window watching Boston lights and remembering Elena pregnant with Noah. The joy and terror of impending fatherhood. How much he'd taken for granted, believing they had decades to raise children who would grow into adults they'd never meet. What if I lose them again? The question addressed only darkness and the particular silence that came from fears too large to share during daylight. What if the universe was just letting me believe things could be different before taking everything away again? But morning always came, and with it the mundane requirements of continuing doctor appointments and grocery shopping and helping Sophie with multiplication tables. Life insisted on being lived whether you felt worthy of living it or not. The birth happened on an April morning when cherry blossoms had started blooming across Boston, turning the city pink and white with the fleeting beauty that only lasted days before petals fell and decay began. Victoria's water broke at 3 a.m. By 4:15, they were at Mass General Hospital, the same facility where Marcus had been taken after discovering his family had died. The symmetry felt almost too pointed to be coincidence. Life and death cycling through the same corridors, the same smells of antiseptic and hope, mixing in ratios that varied by floor and circumstance. Labor lasted 14 hours. Marcus held Victoria's hand through contractions that looked agonizing, despite her attempts to minimize the pain. Nurses came and went with the practiced efficiency of people who'd witnessed thousands of births and knew which ones required intervention versus patience. Sophie waited at home with the nanny under strict instructions to keep her phone charged so she could hear updates immediately. She sent texts every 30 minutes asking if her brother or sister had arrived yet, each message more impatient than the last. At 6:47 p.m., after a final push that made Victoria scream with effort that transcended any corporate challenge she'd ever faced, their son entered the world. Small and red and furious about the transition from warm safety to cold brightness, expressing his opinions through cries that filled the delivery room. The nurse placed him on Victoria's chest, skin to skin, and Marcus watched two of the people he loved most meet each other for the first time. His son, they had a son. The reality felt impossible, like verb tenses that didn't exist in any language he knew how to speak. "Hello, Wyatt." Victoria's voice carried exhaustion and wonder in equal measure. They'd chosen the name weeks ago, agreeing it sounded strong without being pretentious. "We've been waiting for you for a very long time." When they finally let Marcus hold me, the weight felt simultaneously negligible and enormous. 7 pounds, 4 ounces of human being who would depend entirely on their imperfect wisdom and limited capacity to protect him from the universe's arbitrary cruelties. Wyatt's eyes were closed, face scrunched in the particular expression newborns deployed while adjusting to existence. His tiny hand wrapped around Marcus's finger with grip strength that seemed evolutionarily designed to prevent abandonment. Marcus's whisper came like prayer. "Hello, my son. I've been waiting for you longer than you can possibly understand." The tears came freely now, not just grief anymore, but gratitude and fear, and the overwhelming responsibility of being trusted with something so fragile. He thought about Elena and Emma, and Noah wondered if somewhere they could see this moment, and whether they'd understand he was trying to honor them by living fully instead of merely surviving. Sophie arrived an hour later, practically vibrating with excitement. She climbed onto the hospital bed with careful attention to avoiding Victoria's IV lines and surgical aftermath, peering down at the small bundle in Marcus's arms. "He's so tiny." Her whisper suggested awe mixed with concern. "Can I hold him?" Marcus nodded, guiding her arms into the correct position to support Wyatt's disproportionately large head. Sophie looked down at her brother with expression that cycled through wonder and fierce protectiveness. "Little brother, I'm Sophie. I'm your big sister, and I promise I'll protect you from everything bad." The vow carried the absolute certainty of 6-year-olds who hadn't learned yet how many things existed beyond their power to prevent. Marcus and Victoria exchanged looks above their children's heads. Two people who'd learned intimately that promises couldn't protect against mechanical failures and cellular mutations, and all the ways the universe specialized in destroying what you'd started believing was secure. But they'd also learned that making promises anyway was the only response that honored the people you'd lost and the people you still had. This was their family. Not perfect, not guaranteed, just real pieced together from wreckage and faith and the hard daily work of choosing each other, despite knowing how badly choosing could end. 3 years passed with the particular velocity of early childhood. Time moved differently when measured in Sophie's progression through elementary school and Wyatt's transformation from infant to small human capable of speech and opinions and the specific chaos only 3-year-olds achieved. Marcus stood in his Apex office on a Tuesday afternoon looking out at Boston from the 47th floor. The view had become familiar, not through habituation that bred contempt, but through daily exposure that transformed the extraordinary into baseline reality. Co-CEO. The title still felt surreal despite 3 years of performance reviews and board approvals that had nothing to do with marrying the founder. Marcus and Victoria ran Apex together now, not because romance demanded power sharing, but because his analytics expertise and her strategic vision complemented each other in ways that tripled the company's value since his hiring. The door opened. Victoria entered, carrying Wyatt, who'd insisted on visiting the office despite it being a school day. He wore tiny sneakers that lit up when he walked and a t-shirt declaring "Future Engineer" in letters he couldn't read yet. "Dada." Wyatt launched himself from Victoria's arms with the confidence of children who'd never learned to doubt that adults would catch them. Marcus caught him automatically, the motion now instinctive after 3 years. "Hey, buddy, aren't you supposed to be at preschool?" Victoria settled into the chair across from his desk. "Teacher in service day." I figured you could use a break from the quarterly projections. Marcus hoisted Wyatt onto his shoulders, feeling small hands grip his hair for stability. Through the window, Boston spread in every direction, the city that had witnessed his transformation from invisible janitor to executive, from someone wanting to stop existing to someone building futures he had stopped believing he deserved. Dada, why is the city so small from up here? The question carried the particular philosophy of three-year-olds who'd noticed something profound without understanding the implications. Marcus considered how to explain perspective and distance in terms a preschooler could process. It's not actually smaller. We're just really high up, so everything looks different from this angle. Wyatt absorbed this solemnly, then lost interest in favor of more pressing concerns. Can we get ice cream? Victoria laughed. It's 11 a.m. Ice cream doesn't care about time, Mama. The logic was unassailable. Marcus caught Victoria's eye, both of them grinning at their son's 3-year-old wisdom. These small moments, ordinary to the point of mundane, felt precious in ways neither took for granted. That evening, the whole family gathered for Sunday dinner, despite it being Tuesday. Sophie had insisted on the tradition every week, all of them together around one table, no phones or laptops allowed, just conversation and presence. She'd grown into a thoughtful 9-year-old who took her big sister responsibilities with gravity that occasionally bordered on excessive. Currently, as she was helping Wyatt cut his chicken into bites, small enough that choking was statistically improbable. Careful, Wyatt. Remember to chew completely before swallowing. Wyatt nodded seriously, then immediately took too large a bite and had to be coached through proper mastication. Marcus watched them with the particular attention of someone who'd learned through catastrophic loss to notice these moments while they were happening, instead of only in retrospective grief. This was the family he'd stopped believing was possible. Not replacement for what he'd lost, replacement was impossible and insulting to suggest. But new construction built from different materials toward different futures. After dinner, after Wyatt had been wrestled into pajamas and read 3 stories, and finally convinced that sleep was inevitable, Marcus found himself in his home office, looking at the photograph he'd carried through 5 years of poverty and despair. Elena smiled out at him, frozen at 35, with Noah and Emma grinning beside her. His parents stood behind them, proud grandparents who'd retired early to be close to family that would die together in Pennsylvania mountains. He kissed the photograph gently, the ritual he'd developed over 3 years of therapy and hard internal work. I hope you see this. I hope you know I'm happy and I haven't forgotten you. That loving them doesn't erase loving you. Placing the photo back on the shelf, he turned to the newer frame beside it. Marcus, Victoria, Sophie, and Wyatt at the beach last summer, all of them laughing at something the camera hadn't captured, but memory preserved. 2 families, 2 lives, both loved and both honored, and both part of who he was now. Victoria appeared in the doorway, watching him with expression that suggested she understood exactly what internal work he was doing. Ready to come to bed? Marcus crossed to her, taking her hand and letting her lead him toward their bedroom and the life they'd built from impossible beginnings. Yeah, I'm ready. Not just ready to sleep, but ready to live. Really live, not just exist through the hours until something changed. To be present for Sophie's elementary school concerts and Wyatt's first day of kindergarten, and all the ordinary futures that stretched ahead with their mixture of joy and inevitable loss. 5 years ago, he'd believed his story had ended in Pennsylvania. But standing in the hallway with Victoria's hand in his, children sleeping safely in rooms they'd never have to leave against their will, Marcus understood something fundamental had shifted. Sometimes life gave you a second chance. Not because you deserved it or earned it through suffering, but because someone believed you did. And that belief, that single moment of grace, when a stranger knelt on dirty pavement and offered hope to someone who'd stopped hoping, could change everything. Marcus Chen had learned that on a dusty sidewalk in Dorchester, and he'd spend the rest of his life proving that some chances were worth taking, especially the crazy ones, especially when they required believing broken people could be rebuilt into something new.